September 24th, 1911, Ten Sleep, Wyoming. At the Red Bank Ranch, a 17-year-old, Rhoda Spees, and her friend, Mary Ribideau, were sent out on an errand from the main ranch headquarters to another cabin known as the Canyon House. It is here the former governor, William Richards, lived with his daughter and son-in-law, 21-year-old Edna Jenkins and 22-year-old Thomas Jenkins. Now William, he was out of town on a hunting trip, but these girls had been sent to check on the newly wedded couple, as no one had heard from them in a couple of days. As they got closer, they were struck by something odd. Their cabin was eerily dark and silent. But it wasn't just that. As they passed the corral and barn, they noticed the door was wide open, which was typically not the case. As they passed on by, trying to make sense of the mysterious situation, they suddenly seen 3 horses dash out and run away. It was pretty dark, and Mary was unsure, but she could have swore she seen a man running out behind the horses. Not knowing exactly what was going on, the brave girls continued to ride forward, until Rhoda's horse bucked up on her and refused to go any further, seemingly afraid to walk past a certain tree. Strangely, the tree had something bundled lying underneath, which neither of the girls could identify because the light from the day was fading. But it's probably what spooked Rhoda's horse. Unable to go any further, Mary tried to ride on up. Her horse was much calmer and actually kept on walking, and she made it to the back door of the cabin. Since both girls were here often, she knew that there were always fresh drinking water, which was kept in 2 buckets on a bench just inside the door. As she made her way up, she noticed it was too dark to see inside, but she felt around in the bucket for the dipper and found one of the buckets empty, and the other only had warm, stale water. The girls now found themselves in a peculiar situation, and the only thing Mary could think to do was to go back to the tree to see what that was laying underneath it, since Rhoda's horse was still too spooked to go. So Mary would get closer and closer, while Rhoda's horse kept dancing around. Mary then caught sight of something that shook her up. What she thought was a random bundle was a human body, a deceased body. She was now scared, and with the light fading quickly, she didn't get a great look, but she suspected that it was an Indian. She quickly jumped on her horse, and both her and Rhoda took back off at full speed towards the headquarters. Now the next part is a little strange, because when the 2 girls told the men about what they had seen, they didn't seem to be interested in going to check everything out. I couldn't find out why that was. Maybe it's because the girls thought it was an Indian, or maybe because the light was fading. Regardless, they would put a party together and leave a few hours later at about 8:30 p.m. And sure enough, when they got to the tree, they found the dead body. And it was that of Edna Richards Jenkins, who, as I mentioned previously, was the daughter of the former governor of Wyoming, William A. Richards. And the cabin that Mary had checked for water earlier was owned by him. What was strange was Edna's husband, Thomas Jenkins, was nowhere to be found. The 2 had only been married for 4 months, but I'm sure, considering the situation, everybody was suspicious of him at first. But when they walked into the house, they found Thomas had been shot through the heart and was lying on a bare mattress on the bedroom floor. Mary's body, on the other hand, had 3 bullet wounds, 1 in her temple and a couple in her chest. The strangest part was the pistol was sitting in her left hand, and another one was laying next to her body. And it's also important to point out now, she was right-handed. After studying the scene and taking the 2 bodies to the coroner, Edna's father, the former governor, William, was sent a telegram. He had been out of town hunting and would immediately make the long trip back home via automobile, which was still something new to the world and not incredibly fast, since this was way in the early days of criminal investigation and out in the middle of nowhere. Police had no idea where to start, nor did it help that there just wasn't much evidence of what exactly happened. But the fact that Edna's father was a former governor, well, resources would be allocated to find the murderer. And you may think this sounds like a simple murder-suicide, and that's actually what the first coroner's jury found. But their theory was really kinda insane. Their finding was the 2 had gotten into an argument, and then Thomas shot Edna twice in the lungs, which incapacitated her. Thomas then felt guilty about what he had done, went inside the home, set his mattress on fire, laid down, and pulled the trigger. About this time, Edna would regain her composure, stumble to the home, seen the mattress on fire, took water from the bucket and put the fire out, then, seeing she was too late, grabbed both guns, walked outside to the tree where she ended her own life, which you have to admit seems like a huge stretch. This might be why the local newspapers suggested the two had made a pact to end it together, which also seems strange that one did it in the bedroom and the other one did it out in the yard. Regardless, as crazy as that sounded, there was some evidence to back it up. Or maybe I should say, lack of evidence, like there were no footprints in the area other than Edna and Thomas, nor were there any signs that any other person had been here in a while. Meanwhile, Edna's father, the former governor, would return and start his own investigation and released a statement to the press which said he did not accept the coroner jury's verdict because there was no evidence that suggested that either Edna or Thomas had planned this. In fact, William had been living with the couple in that cabin for a while and knew their habits. Actually, it was him that was able to come up with the time for the murders because he knew when they had done their chores. He pointed out the laundry had been cleaned but was still damp, which meant they would be ironed Saturday morning, just like the bread they made on Friday afternoon was still setting out, where it had been left to cool, leading him to the conclusion that this happened sometime between Friday afternoon and Saturday morning. But he also noted there had been no trouble from the couple leading up to this, and soon investigators found letters from Edna to Thomas, as well as her father, and both were happy and affectionate in tone. But what really tipped the scales was when investigators found 2 more bullets in the bedroom wall and 3 in the living room. One of these had been fired through a portrait of Edna. There was also the fact that cash and jewelry had been missing, and thinking back, why was the barn door opened? And was that a man that really ran out behind the horses? Because of all these new findings, another coroner's jury was held, this time about 2 months after the crime, and they released a new verdict. Edna and Thomas both died at the hands of a person or persons unknown. In addition to the bullet holes found, authorities had other evidence which was not made public until the former governor got involved, and he made it go public. Like, Edna's right shoulder had the imprint of a heavy hand with a thumb on front and 4 fingers on the back, which clearly left spots on her skin. The bone above her left eye had also been broken and indented by a blow from a smooth object or instrument, which never broke the skin. She had also been wearing a nightgown with her bathrobe over it, and there were 2 bullet holes in the gown, but not in the robe. In addition, her legs had been cut and scratched and had been bleeding, and the ball of one toe was completely torn off, yet she had knee-length stockings on that were undamaged. And maybe the most crazy part, there was no blood under the tree where Edna was found laying. But that's not the only oddity. The carpet underneath the bed, as well as the mattress on the floor, was absolutely soaked with water, which, as mentioned earlier, probably came from the empty bucket of water that Mary had found upon first arriving, and it was probably used to throw onto the mattress, which appeared as if it had been set on fire. Richard's notes on this investigation, which we still have, also pointed out he had unloaded 3 revolvers which were at the cabin before he went out of town on his hunting trip. Yet, when he got back and did his investigation, he found that all the cartridges had been reloaded, which he suggested meant that Edna and Thomas were afraid of someone. He also had an answer for the mattress being on the floor. That simply meant they were trying to stay out of sight of the nearby window, or they wanted to be able to escape quickly. Although, it has to be pointed out that some accounts say the bed had been made up but not laid on, while other accounts claim the mattress was bare. The investigation went nowhere for a while, but they would soon catch a break, because a newspaper subscription salesman and reporter named Edward T. Payton would randomly show up in the vicinity of the ranch and was, quote, clearly out of his head and caused so much trouble that the sheriff was notified. It should be noted, Payton had been in and out of the mental state hospital 4 separate times and was known to have fits of mental illness, but it's during this episode specifically that he would constantly mutter about the dead woman and made other remarks that detectives found suspicious, which they never divulged what these comments were. It also looked pretty suspicious because he had attacked Governor Richards in newspaper columns in the 1894 election and accused him of fraudulent land deals, although that was never proven. Regardless, he was known to hate the governor. He would be the only person ever arrested in connection with the case, but no evidence against him was found, and questioning didn't really lead to anything, so he was released a couple of weeks later. Then, 2 other men were also briefly suspected, a O.K. Fullerton, who was a handyman that did odd jobs around the ranch. He was said to be attracted to Edna and was widely known to be a thief in the area, while a Tom O'Day had been in a gang and served time in prison, and that gang had frequently traveled along a trail that went by the ranch, and allegedly O'Day had been spotted there or near there on the day of the murder, but there was no real evidence that he was connected to the crime, and T2 was soon forgotten about. And that's pretty much it. The case was never solved, and it's one of the most perplexing in the history of Wyoming, not only due to the fact that one of the victims was the daughter of a governor, but because of the other oddities. No footprints, yet Edna's body had been moved, but Thomas could not have moved her because there was no gun in the room for him to have ended his own life. So who put Edna's robe on? Why did they put the gun in her left hand when she was right-handed? How did the mattress catch fire? Or, if someone did set it on fire, why throw water all over it afterwards? Who shot the portrait? And maybe most importantly, did Mary, the young girl, really see a man fleeing out of the barn behind the horses? Or was the light from the dusk playing tricks on her eyes? That's something she could never answer for the rest of her life. February 9th, 1964, Nampa, Idaho. It was during the late night hours of 1:30 to 2 a.m. when a resident of Sherman Avenue would see the headlights roll in. Across the street was 51-year-old neighbor Lillian Richey. She had just came back from a nightclub in Garden City, about a 25-minute ride away. The neighbor would then strangely see Lillian's car back out of the driveway and be driven away by a man. The neighbor now at this point had seen the kitchen light in Lillian's home turned on, so he thought nothing else of it. But it would be 2 days later, when Lillian was scheduled to show up for work, that she didn't arrive, and people began to wonder. And they soon put it together that no one had heard from her in a couple of days. Part of the reason for this was Lillian lived alone as she was a widow, and her 2 sons were adults and had moved out long ago, and they didn't even live nearby. Regardless, the police were notified, and they soon went over to do a wellness check on Lillian. And now, strangely, her car was back in the driveway, but she was not there. The door was unlocked, and the officers walked in and found nothing out of the ordinary. No sign of forced entry or a struggle. But they did find a note, which strangely read, "Dear Lillian, have been here since 11. Have looked for a note and haven't found a thing. I don't know what to think. Have gone to Harmony Cafe to have breakfast, then plan to go to John Yoder for a short time." The note was then signed at the bottom, and this signature has long been a source of discussion, since it's kinda hard to make out what it says exactly. One blog, which discusses missing person cases, has made the argument that the signature was Arthur Tooby, coincidentally a California cattle rancher and member of a cattlemen's association, which will be important later on. But no one is certain if that is the name. I mean, to me it looks like it says Kurt Tosley, but what do I know? But here's where things get strange. Police would actually find this man, and they've never publicly identified him, which I will tell you why in a second. And they didn't disclose how they tracked him down, but upon finding him, they began to fill in the blanks. They wanted to know what had happened the night before last when he had went out with Lillian. And according to him, he was actually from California and had came to Boise to attend a cattle convention. And in that time frame, he met up with Lillian. Now, had he known her before this, or was this the first time meeting her? That is unknown. But that evening, they would go to a club together where they stayed out to about 1 a.m. or so, and he took her back home. And it was here he would drop her off and leave, as she had allowed him to borrow her car, which was confirmed by what the neighbor had seen that night. As to how the car got back in the driveway, well, the next morning, they had planned to meet about 11 a.m. where he would drop the car off and have breakfast with her, and he was going to bring along a male friend. And this other man, we know even less about. But when they got there that next morning to drop it off, they saw the garage door open, and when they got up to the door and knocked, nobody answered, so they went inside. They walked around and called for her, and she never replied. Soon, he would write the note and leave, and that was basically it. Now obviously, you know these guys would be the top suspects, but that ended up not being the case. The police grilled these two extensively, but they were cooperative, and eventually completely cleared, much to the investigators' own frustration. Going so hard after these two was basically a waste of time, but it wasn't just the questioning of them that allowed them to rule them out. Nah, there were other things that went against them. Like, Lillian had wore a black evening wrap around her dress that evening, and when she got back home, she left it there, along with basically everything else she had. Even a plane ticket she was going to use to visit her sons later that month. But what was missing made it even more perplexing. Although her purse was left behind, a few items from it had been taken. There was also a green and brown plaid dress that had been removed from the closet, and this was not the same dress that she had worn to the club, which was a black cocktail dress. On top of that, there was a different purse which was missing, and was possibly used to carry the missing items from the other purse. And finally, a book called A Man Named Peter, the #1 seller in 1951, was also missing, and that's pretty much it. The case went cold before the end of the year and didn't have any movement on it whatsoever for the next 60 years. Her sons had even hired private investigators over the decades, and they too never found anything. There was just no evidence of a break-in or anything that suggested she was attacked or abducted. There was some slight movement in 2018 when the local police performed a new search, even digging for her remains under the school administrative office, after hearing rumors that her body had been buried there. But it ended up being just rumors. And as far as the two men go, obviously, their names were protected once they were determined to not be suspects. Actually, they weren't even considered persons of interest. And that name, Arthur Tooby, if that's what the signature says, he was just a cattleman that lived a very normal law-abiding life. So what actually happened? Well, there's not a lot of theories on this one. It's one of the more bizarre cases we have ever covered. One theory you can find suggested is accidental death. Lillian most likely had alcohol at the club, and maybe she was disoriented and fell, and ended up with a head injury. This one is very possible, but where did she go? And shouldn't someone have found her? And how far could she have gotten if she was that drunk? But it makes more sense than an abduction, since there was no sign of a struggle. Some obviously still believe the men were involved, but police were confident they weren't. Sadly, this case will probably never be solved. April 20th, 1890, Tombstone, Arizona, home of the very famous gunfight at the OK Corral, plays host to this next very weird cryptid mystery. It all started when two ranchers were returning from a trip to the Huachuca Mountains about 40 miles away, and when traveling through this desert landscape, they came across one of the most bizarre creatures we have ever looked at. According to the men, resting on the sand-covered floor was an animal resembling an alligator with an extremely long tail and giant wings. The creature, upon spotting them, began flapping its wings in an attempt to escape. And it did make it up into the air, although briefly, before it came back down to the ground. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to be very exhausted and was only capable of making short flights, or at least, that's all it was capable of by the time these men had found it. These men, by the way, were totally shocked and for a few seconds just watched it, before the ranchers regained their composure and, rifles in hand, rode after the beast. They would actually chase it for several miles, while the cryptid would make a series of short flights over and over trying to escape them. Finally, the men closed in and opened fire on the creature, which was much larger than they first thought. It was gigantic. The cryptid, although in pain, turned towards the men and prepared to attack, but because it was so exhausted, could never get close enough to them. The men continued to shoot the animal, which then rolled over and stopped moving. The men were stumped. What had they shot? The two would get closer and began to examine it. From head to the tip of its tail, it was a staggering 92 feet long, while its greatest diameter was just over 4 feet. The wingspan was an insane 160 feet from tip to tip, and the wings were transparent like membranes. The creature only had 2 feet, which sat about a yard in front of where the wings were attached. The head itself was about 8 feet long, and its jaws contained thick, straight, sharp teeth. Its eyes were also estimated to be about the size of a dinner plate, and they protruded out of the head. They also noted that the animal had no hair or feathers, just smooth skin, which of course was no help against gunfire. It would be 5 days later when the ranchers finally made it back to Tombstone, and that's when one of the men would go share his story with the town, and he also let them know he planned to skin the monster and bring it in. And the following day, the story would make it to the local newspaper, which also stated that several of the prominent men from the area were going to try and bring the body back to town before it was skinned, and then send it back to the east for scientists to examine. And sadly, like a lot of weird cases from this time, there was never a follow-up. However, although the article didn't cause shockwaves across the country, a few papers around California picked up the story, and a couple of months later, articles began popping up in Kansas newspapers, and presumably other Midwestern states. Now typically, I would wrap this one up and go straight to the theories, with the main one being that this was a total fabrication by the newspaper, which was not unusual for this time frame, because they were widely known to publish these crazy fictional tales about monsters, airships, etc., just to boost circulation. But this one is a little bit different, because although the story was quickly forgotten, it would be over 70 years later, in 1963, when the story would get a bit of a resurgence. It came about in a magazine article by Jack Pearl entitled "Monster Bird That Carries Off Human Beings." As you can guess, the article was more fiction than fact, and that's because he was essentially just writing his article based on letters by a man named Hy Cramner, who had a theory that Thunderbirds, which had came from Native American legends, were possibly evidence for modern reportings of pterodactyls, and one of these stories he mentioned in particular was our story of the 1890 Tombstone Monster. Now what makes this one interesting is Cramner's letters, as well as Pearl's article, tells a slightly different story. It claims that it did not happen in 1890, but in 1886, and it only states that it was an odd but giant bird that they had shot. And the most important part was that the animal was then nailed up to the wall of the Tombstone Epitaph building, the newspaper place. And then its picture was taken, and it was nowhere near the 160 feet from wingtip to wingtip. Instead, it was 36 feet, and the photo showed 6 men with their outstretched arms touching lined up under the bird to show how big it was. Pearl would finish his segment by stating that according to the original records, all the men knew the bird was actually a pterodactyl. Now you may have heard this story before, but if you haven't, this would end up leading to one of the biggest mysteries in cryptid history, the legendary Lost Thunderbird photo, with numerous people claiming to have seen this old photo in a magazine or a book, but for whatever reason, it has been lost. Interestingly, Pearl's article did not have the picture, nor did Cramner, the writer of the letters so much of this article was based on. But that's because there were no photos in the original newspaper which told the story of the Tombstone Monster, and the only illustrations were black and white block prints and etchings. Photos were most likely not feasible for this small town newspaper, as it's doubtful they had the equipment to do it. But here's where the problem lies. This was 2 separate stories, one being the 1886 case of the 36-foot flying creature said to be a pterodactyl, which was shot, and then a photo may or may not have been taken and might be lost, versus our story of the 1890 monster. And all of this confusion is because of the 1963 article by Pearl, which led to people believing that the photo of this bird that is missing is actually of the case that we are discussing, the 1890 mystery of the Tombstone Monster. Further confusing things is sometimes the story was said to have taken place as early as 1882 or as late as 1901. And that's why I don't want to discuss the photo portion of this mystery that much. It's way too confusing, and honestly, there's a ton of videos on YouTube that explain the story much better. The part I want to focus on solely is the event in 1890. Did these men really shoot down some flying reptile creature whose wingspan was well over 100 feet? If so, what was it? The most likely scenario is that it was just sensationalist journalism to sell a newspaper, which was mixed in with the Native American folklore of thunderbirds. It's also possible they misidentified a real animal, such as the California condor, whose wingspan can get close to 10 feet. But maybe that one's not as likely. Either way, it's a very confusing case. September 4th, 1964, Cisco Grove, California. 28-year-old Donald Schrum and a group of friends decided to go bow hunting, but unfortunately for Donald, at some point during the hunt, he became separated from the rest of the party and could not find his friends. As the evening turned to night, Donald knew he would have to find some kind of way to remain safe, so he climbed up a tree where he planned to sleep for the night. However, this wouldn't be as safe as he thought it would, because as he got comfortable and began to drift off, a white light at a low altitude began to zigzag through the trees. This relieved Donald, of course, because he thought it was a rescue helicopter that was searching for him. So he jumped down from the tree, pulled out his flares, and began lighting them, in hopes of trying to capture the attention of the pilot overhead. As soon as he done this, the light would turn towards him and came to a stop about 50 yards away. Donald then waited as the craft slowly lowered to the ground, but as it got closer, he soon realized it was not a helicopter. Donald would go on to describe it as cigar-shaped and the size of a 14-story building. As this craft hovered, a smaller scout aircraft would exit the larger one and then land nearby. Of course, this frightened Donald, who immediately began climbing back up into the tree. From here, he recalled that 3 beings would get out of the aircraft and approach the trees. 2 of them were humanoids, a little over 5 feet tall, with silvery uniforms that covered their heads and wearing something similar to welding goggles. As the 3rd being approached, Donald would state it looked more like a sci-fi robot. He was darker in color and had 2 reddish-orange eyes. In the place where it would typically have a mouth, he seen a slit-like opening that would drop down like the door of an oven. Donald began to panic because now all 3 beings were down below him, and they grabbed the tree and began shaking it in an attempt to throw him out. Donald described vividly that the robot entity would lower its jaw and then a rectangular gap would emit a puff of smoke in his direction. This smoke would spread out like a mist and cause Donald to lose consciousness as it reached him. And if you're thinking Donald would come to and see that these alien beings were gone, well, think again, because they were still below him shaking the tree. That's when Donald started to get nauseous. But you see, he came up with a quick plan. He would take extra bits of clothing, light it, and then throw it down at them, which did actually make them back off, although only for a short time, before coming back and shaking the tree again. Donald studied the situation carefully, and that's when he started to speculate that audio signals from the UFO seemed to be directing these aliens. He then thought maybe the best course of action was to shoot an arrow at these things, and he did just that. The first arrow hit one and a spark came off of it, indicating that they were indeed metallic. He would shoot 2 more times, which caused the beings to scatter. However, this was not the end, because now a second robot left the aircraft and made its way to the tree, where it emitted a white vapor which caused Donald to lose consciousness a second time. When he awoke, he saw 2 of the humanoids were now climbing the tree, so he began throwing things at them to slow them down. This would go on all night long, and by the early morning, more humanoids arrived, and after another batch of smoke, Donald passed out one final time, and he woke up to see all the aliens were now gone. But unfortunately for Donald, he had been tied up to a tree by his belt. His friends by this point had also located him, and they helped him get out of the tree. And if you would think nobody would believe this story, one of these other hunters had also gotten lost, and he would confirm he had seen the same UFO, but he had never seen the aliens. Once untied, Donald would collect all of his belongings from the ground that he had tossed out at the invaders the night before. Then he sought medical attention for possible radiation exposure, but was determined to be okay. Eventually, the events would reach the McClellan Air Force Base, who contacted him and arranged a secret meeting to take place in an empty house off base. They would take the arrows, which still had metal shavings on it from the robot, and they began to pressure Donald to doubt his memory, and they offered up other explanations for him to choose from. He eventually agreed because he was afraid, and stated he didn't know what it was he had actually seen, but he did stick to the same story for the next 50 years. And that's pretty much it. A crazy story. But what really happened? Let's start with the obvious. It was really alien visitors from another planet, or even another star system. The sophisticated technology would point towards this. Things like the cigar-shaped UFO, scout aircrafts, and the vapor emitters are pretty advanced. And a lot of ufologists point to this case as being one of the more important ones in UFO history. Others suggest secret military technology, like drones, which would have been really advanced for the early 60s. However, the most plausible explanation is something psychological. Maybe him being lost caused immense fear, and the isolation caused something like sleep paralysis, which led to hallucinations, although the arrows with metallic sparks would seem to rule that out, if they exist. Overall, a very crazy case. The Bermuda Triangle, the Bennington Triangle, and the Alaskan Triangle are all mysterious locations where spooky disappearances have occurred. The areas are generally defined as a triangle, obviously, and while those are the three most popular in North America, did you know there is one maybe creepier than all three, located right in New Mexico, and it's known as the Pecos Triangle, a place where people are swallowed up whole and never seen again. The area is largely made up of thick woods from the Carson and Santa Fe National Forest, roughly 224,000 acres, and while not strictly a triangle, it had been given the nickname due to the oddities which have occurred there. Now, before we dive into what makes this range mysterious, I have to point out that the Pecos Triangle doesn't even lead the state in disappearances. That belongs to the northwest corner of New Mexico in Navajo Nation. But even the Gila Wilderness, especially the Black Range and the Mazano Mountains, have as much or more disappearances than Pecos. The difference is, the Pecos Triangle has many more missing person cases where there's no clear resolution as to what had happened. They usually follow a similar pattern. The victim gets separated from the group and vanishes, and then when a search party arrives, they find footsteps that stop suddenly, and dogs just abruptly lose their scent. Most of these people are never found, but some of them are eventually, although it's usually months later, and in most cases, they are found unclothed and severely injured, but deceased from exposure to the elements. Another trait these people share is that most of them were experienced outdoorsmen who are physically fit, while others are actually found way off the road in their vehicles, nowhere near their intended route. Basically, this is an area that has cases that skew heavily towards the 411 type, and that's the basic description of this area. But what good does that do unless we discuss some of the key cases? Now, these aren't going to be deep dives, but brief summaries to show the pattern. First, Melvin Needle, a 61-year-old bow hunter who, on September 6, 2009, at around 4:30 p.m., told his friends at campsite he was going down the trail just a little ways and would come back. And he never did. He was in great physical condition to be 61. He actually owned a Pilates gym and was a popular fitness instructor, on top of being an outdoorsman. He had actually gotten lost in the woods once before, and it frightened him, and because of that, he usually carried his GPS with him while he was out in the woods, and he would never go far from the campsite. Making it even stranger was when searchers arrived, the dogs quickly picked up his scent on the trail that he had taken, and they followed it for 50 yards before it just stopped. No remains were ever found. Then there's 50-year-old Stanley Virgil, who again was hunting with friends and broke off on his own, and a while later, his friends heard him fire 2 shots. They assumed he had gotten a deer, but when they searched for him, they could not find him. So they fired off a sounding shot into the air and waited. and then Stanley responded with a shot of his own, but this time, he was further away than the first 2 shots. Unfortunately, snow and fog came into the area, and his friends knew that they would never find him, so they called search and rescue. The dogs were never able to pick up a scent. Some sources say he was spotted on a trail cam at a ranch about 9:30 that night, bundled up against the cold, while some sources say he knocked on the door of a mobile home where the resident was a woman with kids and she turned him away. Whatever the case, his remains were eventually found by an off-duty cop who was fishing. His ribs had been smashed and his head had signs of trauma, yet his death was caused by drowning. Then, there's the cases of the unidentified. The Mora County John Doe was found in Wagon Mound in 2015, and was basically just a few bones by that point. The deceased was thought to be a white male between 25 and 40, and whoever he was, he came super prepared. He had a backpack with a sleeping bag, flashlight, garbage bag, extra clothes to keep warm, and all of this stuff was pretty expensive, along with his expensive sunglasses. It's believed he was an avid outdoorsman, but how he ended up here and why he was never reported as missing is still unknown. There are several more examples like the previous ones, but obviously we can't go over every one of them, since our mystery is more about the location. And that leads us to the theories. Is this area really a place where several disappearances take place due to unexplained phenomena? Obviously, the most likely theory is just disorientation and the rugged terrain. Even experienced outdoorsmen can get lost in this area, where much of the terrain looks identical to areas you already passed through. The landmarks become impossible to go by, and the area is known to be hit with unpredictable weather like fog or very cold nights, on top of the limited water supply, and all that makes it very dangerous. There's also the fact that the scent trails the dogs lose are because of the factors like wind or other animal activity in the area. There's also the issue that sometimes people just decide to do something they normally wouldn't do, like separating from the group, and then they end up making a mistake and it just cascades into bigger and bigger mistakes until it ends with their demise. But for many, they still believe the answer is paranormal activity. Maybe something like mysterious energy fields popping up, or maybe an electromagnetic disturbance which disorients people, or maybe they just walk into some portal. Some even suggest skinwalkers, aliens, shadow people, or many other varying types of supernatural explanations. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of the Western Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.